In the first episode, I took you step by step through my process as I uncovered the existence of at least 70 mandatory hotel quarantine sites Canada-wide. That list has now been expanded to 73 sites Canada-wide, 54 of which I have the direct addresses for. I then proved, using the government's own words against them, that there are federally designated isolation centers apart from these hotel quarantine sites. In episode 2, I showed you the hundreds and hundreds of applications by hotel companies all across the province to become mandatory hotel quarantine sites for the government. We also took a deep dive into some of the other companies with applications on this website. There are Fort McMurray companies with work camps that can fit up to 900 isolated rooms. The modular construction companies that can erect tall buildings in very little amounts of time. And also, Onyx, a COVID-based company that can drive out to a work site in a remote location in Fort McMurray or anywhere in northern Alberta and snatch workers from a job site simply for showing symptoms. Now, in episode 3, we are going to continue to put pieces of the puzzle together to try to bring clarity to what the big picture here is. I know there are some viral videos out there of airport travelers that are walking out of the airport without quarantining and just saying, no, I refuse, and the cops just let them walk out. Now, I don't want to take anything away from those videos or from the inspiration that may provide, but I do need to point out reality to you, that it is not just a free walkout, and I will get to that in a minute.
Okay, Riggs.
And we're gonna go outside. We're gonna refuse their stupid test and tell everybody to refuse their stupid test. Hi. Yes, because I have a medical condition, so I don't need to wear one. And I'm also a Canadian citizen, and this is a violation of our Charter Right, Section 6, and a violation of the Emergency Act 14.1. So I'm going to be declining your test today. Thank you very much. No problem. I'll happily do that. Everybody in here, if you are a Canadian citizen, simply deny the test, deny their quarantine, and there's nothing you can do. They cannot stop you. They cannot force you. You are a citizen. You have rights. If you want to wait in the line for 2 hours, let them put shit up your nose. Go right ahead. But if you have a brain and you have balls, just say no.
Is this true? We can just refuse the tests and walk right out the front door? Well, yes and no. Allow me to explain. This is from a Toronto CBC News article about travelers at Toronto Airport being fined for violating Ontario rules. Several international travelers arriving at Toronto's Pearson Airport have refused to comply with Ontario's rules aimed at curbing the spread of COVID-19, local police said Wednesday. Peel Region Police said that while most cases were resolved after conversations with officers, some people refused to follow the rules and were fined $880 under Ontario regulations. There have been 49 fines handed out since the start of February, a police spokesperson told CBC News. Those fines relate to things like skipping COVID-19 tests or other infractions. The Canadian press had previously reported, erroneously, that those tickets were for violations of new hotel quarantine rules. Skipping COVID-19 tests? Where? Well, at the airport, of course. While that may not be part of the hotel quarantine rules specifically, both sets of unconstitutional government orders are pieces to the same puzzle. Later on, in that same article, it says, police said they will not detain anyone for breaking the hotel quarantine rule, which came into effect this week, unless there are aggravating circumstances involved, such as a criminal offense. They said the Public Health Agency of Canada would be responsible for issuing any potential fines under the Quarantine Act. The Public Health Agency of Canada and the Quarantine Act, what are those? This is the Quarantine Act, instituted by the Paul Martin Liberal government in 2005. Is this act news to you? Don't feel too bad. Most of us don't remember a thing about it either. As I take you through some of this Quarantine Act and point out some things to you, there are a couple things that I want you to keep in mind. One is the overwhelming power of the Federal Minister of Health, Patty Hajdu, and another is the wording that they use in this act. You'll understand what I mean in just a minute. First of all, this is described as an act to prevent the spread of communicable diseases. As you can see, it was put into place in 2005. What communicable diseases were we so concerned about in 2005? Minister, as it is referred to from here on out, means the Minister of Health. That is currently Patty Hajdu. The minister may designate qualified persons or classes of qualified persons as analysts, screening officers, or environmental health officers. The minister may designate medical practitioners or other qualified healthcare practitioners or classes of such persons as quarantine officers. The minister may designate medical practitioners as review officers. The minister shall give a certificate of designation to every screening officer who is not also a customs officer, to every quarantine officer, and to every environmental health officer. An officer to whom a certificate has been given shall produce it on request to the person in charge of a place or conveyance that the officer inspects and to any person that the officer questions. So, if you ask them for this certificate and they cannot produce it, they cannot enforce it. The minister may establish a quarantine station at any place in Canada. Any place in Canada? Isn't that a bit broad? Shouldn't there be some kind of rules as to what places they can use as a quarantine station? Not the health minister. The minister may, by order, designate any place in Canada as a quarantine facility and amend, cancel, or reinstate the designation. Any person in charge of a place shall, at the request of the minister, provide that place to the minister if, in the opinion of the minister, the temporary use of the place as a quarantine facility is necessary to protect public health. The question is, did we elect this health minister because of their qualifications? No. They were not elected, they were appointed. The minister shall consult with the provincial public health authority of the province in which the place is situated before taking possession of it. Who? Dina Hinshaw? Did we elect her? No, she was appointed as well. So two public health authorities who we did not elect get to decide whether or not these buildings are suitable for a quarantine and whether they will just take possession of them at their will and discretion? Any qualified person authorized by the minister may, to determine whether a traveler has a communicable disease or symptoms of one, use any screening technology authorized by the minister that does not involve the entry into the traveler's body of any instrument or other foreign body. So how are they able to use COVID swabs at the airports then and ram them up people's noses? Every traveler shall answer any relevant questions asked by a screening officer or quarantine officer and provide to the officer any information or record in their possession that the officer may reasonably require in the performance of a duty under this act. Well, who gets to determine what is reasonable here? Not you or I. Every traveler shall comply with any reasonable measure ordered by a screening officer or quarantine officer for the purpose of preventing the introduction and spread of a communicable disease. Once again, any reasonable measure. We don't get to decide what is reasonable or not, so who does? A screening officer shall immediately inform a quarantine officer and follow any directive of that officer respecting the traveler if any directive of that officer. Once again, way too broad, way too vague. It leaves it open to their interpretation. So, they will follow any directive of the quarantine officer if the screening officer has reasonable grounds to suspect that a traveler has or might have a communicable disease or is infested with vectors, or has recently been in close proximity to a person who has or might have a communicable disease or is infected with vectors. B. A traveler has refused to be screened by the screening officer under subsection 14(1), or a person authorized to use the screening technology has informed the screening officer that a traveler has refused to be screened under that subsection. C. A traveler has contravened subsection 15(1) by refusing to answer a question asked by the screening officer, or by refusing to provide information or a record that the screening officer required. Or D. A traveler has contravened subsection 15(3) by refusing to comply with a measure ordered by the screening officer. The screening officer may, without directives from a quarantine officer, isolate the traveler individually or within a group until the traveler is assessed by a quarantine officer. Does that sound like something that a free country should have in their laws? A screening officer or quarantine officer who takes any action in respect of a traveler under this act shall, if reasonably possible, inform the traveler of the measure before it is taken. When would it not be reasonably possible to inform the traveler of these measures? A peace officer may, at the request of a screening officer or quarantine officer, arrest without a warrant and bring to a quarantine officer any traveler who the peace officer has reasonable grounds to believe has refused to be isolated or refuses to comply with a measure under subsection 15(3). Arrest without a warrant. Who allowed this? At any time, a traveler may request an examination by a medical practitioner of their choice, in addition to a medical examination conducted under subsection 22(1). The quarantine officer shall inform the traveler of this right, which is fine, but right underneath that it says, the quarantine officer shall accept the request if, in the opinion of the officer, the examination would not unduly delay any measures taken in the administration of this act. So it's completely left up to their discretion. They can accept your request if they think it won't take too long. The examination shall be at the traveler's expense and shall be conducted in the place where the traveler is detained. At our expense? Well, it's already at our expense. Our taxpayer dollars fund the quarantine officers, the screening officers, and this entire program, including all government programs. So we've already paid for it. So they are quarantining you at your expense and then charging you for it again. Are you starting to see who wins in this system? The quarantine officer shall, without delay, send a copy of an order made under subsection 1 to the public health authority specified in the order. The public health agency, once again. Remember when I said in episode 1 that the public health agency I believed was going to be a big factor in all of this? Well, here we go. If a quarantine officer, after the medical examination of a traveler, has reasonable grounds to believe that the traveler has or might have a communicable disease or is infested with vectors, or has recently been in close proximity to a person who has or might have a communicable disease or is infected with vectors, the quarantine officer may order the traveler to comply with treatment or any other measure for preventing the introduction and spread of the communicable disease. So what, like vaccinations? On an ex parte application by a quarantine officer, a provincial court judge within the meaning of Section 2 of the Criminal Code, who is satisfied on information submitted in writing and under oath that a traveler has failed to comply with an order made under subsection 25(1) or Section 26, may issue a warrant directing a peace officer to arrest the traveler and take them to a quarantine officer. So that's how it works. So, if taken before a judge, they can determine whether there are grounds to arrest you based on not following directions. A quarantine officer may detain any traveler who A. has refused to be disinfested or to undergo a health assessment, B. has been required to undergo a medical examination under subsection 22(1), C. has failed to comply with an order made under section 26, D. the quarantine officer has reasonable grounds to believe, I. has or might have a communicable disease or is infested with vectors or has recently been in close proximity to a person who has or might have a communicable disease or is infested with vectors, and 2. is capable of infecting other people, E. has been arrested under Section 27, or F. has been arrested without a warrant under Section 18. Are you starting to get a little frightened yet? But you may still be asking, well, why aren't these police officers arresting people that are skipping out on these COVID tests at the airport or on their hotel quarantine situation? Well, the answer to that is because it's not their job. Whose job is it? Why, the Public Health Agency, of course. In this article from the National Post, published February 24th, 2021, Akil Mukin, a spokesperson for Peel Regional Police, confirmed that officers are not stopping people who refuse to follow the measures. Unless there are some serious or aggravating circumstances where the public's safety is at risk, we are not detaining individuals who are not complying with the regulations under the Quarantine Act, Mukin said. While travelers might be able to dodge mandatory quarantine in a hotel, which can cost up to $2,000 for a 3-day stay, that doesn't mean public health won't follow up and retroactively fine them, Mukin said. The fine could be up to $1,800 per person per day. A spokesperson for public health confirmed that, under the Act, a person who disobeys the mandatory quarantine could face a maximum penalty of $750,000 and or 6 months imprisonment. A source familiar with the situation at Pearson Airport said police do not have the manpower to stop all these people, issue them fines, do the follow-ups, and make sure they're complying. The source said enforcement of the Quarantine Act is all being done by the Public Health Agency. Back to the Quarantine Act. A quarantine officer or an environmental health officer may, to determine whether a conveyance or place or any contents within it could be the source of a communicable disease or whether a traveler has or might have a communicable disease or is infested with vectors, and to enforce this act, A. Stop a conveyance at an entry or departure point or anywhere else in Canada and direct that it be moved to a place where an inspection can be carried out. B. Enter and inspect the conveyance or any place where the conveyance has been. C. Open and examine any cargo, container, baggage, package, or other thing. D. Require any person to produce any record under any terms and conditions that, in the opinion of the officer, are necessary to carry out the inspection. E. Except with respect to a traveler, conduct or cause to be conducted, any test or analysis, or take or cause to be taken any sample. And F. Except with respect to a traveler, take any measurement. Any measurement. Now how about the punishment? No person shall enter a quarantine facility without the authorization of a quarantine officer. No person shall leave a quarantine facility without the authorization of a quarantine officer. No person shall hinder or willfully obstruct a quarantine officer, a screening officer, or an environmental health officer who is carrying out their duties or functions under this act, or make a false or misleading statement, either orally or in writing, to the officer. Every person is guilty of an offense if they cause a risk of imminent death or serious bodily harm to another person while willfully or recklessly contravening this act or the regulations. Punishment. Every person who commits an offense under subsection 1 is liable, A, on conviction on indictment, to a fine of not more than $1 million or to imprisonment for a term of not more than 3 years, or to both, and B, on summary conviction, to a fine of not more than $300,000 or to imprisonment for a term of not more than 6 months, or to both. Failure to comply. Every person who fails to comply with an obligation imposed under subsection 15.3 or 25.1 or section 26 is guilty of an offense and liable on summary conviction to a fine of not more than $200,000 or to imprisonment for a term of not more than 6 months, or to both. So there you have it, straight from the horse's mouth. Why are the local city police not arresting these people or detaining them? Because it's not their job to. It is the Public Health Agencies of Canada's job to enforce. Now, they are a federal organization, obviously, so they can either call upon the local city police to come assist them and arrest you, or they can do it retroactively, or they can come with the RCMP and arrest you. And as stated in this Quarantine Act, they have the power to imprison you or fine you astronomical amounts of money. This is the way our system is set up. This is why we have to fight back. And this is still only the beginning.